Just going live now. Sorry, hold on.
Hello, everyone. Welcome everyone to the final session of what's been, I know, a content-rich and really inspiring week. I think that's particularly amazing because I know the challenges of staying engaged in a Zoom platform, all these different Zoom windows we've been navigating across all the time zones that folks have been navigating. You know, it poses unique challenges for our ability to concentrate and to be able to engage in the kind of spirited dialogue that makes our conferences so vibrant and organic. But still, it's been really heartening and amazing to me to hear the range of perspectives that we've heard over the week. And this final session is really an effort to try to distill some of those key takeaways. So just to say, we really appreciate all of you sticking it out for what I hope you're going to agree is a very important final session. So in terms of the run of show, what we're going to do, we're actually going to begin with a short talk. From there, we're going to go to a discussion that I'll moderate on some of the takeaways from the conference and next steps. And then I'll make some final remarks just to wrap up the conference and give thanks. So before we turn to that moderated discussion that I'll say more about when we get to it, we're privileged to have a talk from someone with a very unique perspective on these issues. So I'm really excited to introduce Dan Zarilli. Dan is the special advisor for climate and sustainability at Columbia University, where he's supporting the creation of the climate school and advising on pathways to achieve the university's deep decarbonization goals. He joins Columbia from the New York City Mayor's office, where he served most recently in the role of Chief Climate Policy Advisor. With senior climate and resilience appointments from Mayors Bloomberg and de Blasio over the past 8 years, he positioned New York as the global leader in the fight against climate change. Notable successes included launching a comprehensive $20 billion climate adaptation program, aligning the city's greenhouse gas emissions reductions with the 1.5 degree Celsius target of the Paris Agreement, divesting the city's pension funds from fossil fuel reserve owners and investing billions into climate solutions, committing to end the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure serving New York City, and launching a groundbreaking program to embed environmental justice into the city's decision-making. Under his leadership in 2019, New York City released its latest long-term strategic plan, the One NYC 2050 plan, which includes bold new actions to confront the climate crisis and also addresses health and wealth inequities, strengthening our democracy in the process. I could go on and on. He served on NOAA's advisory committee for the Sustained National Climate Assessment, served FEMA's National Advisory Council, and advised the state of Louisiana when they updated their coastal master plan a few years ago. Again, I could go on and on. I'll just mention one more thing. He's a licensed professional engineer. So for all these reasons and more, I know you're going to agree that we're really privileged to get to hear his perspective and some remarks before we turn to that closing panel discussion that I mentioned earlier. So with that, Dan, please take it away.
Thank you, Radley, for that kind introduction, and congratulations to you and to all the organizers for pulling off this amazing conference. It's been really an insightful and thought-provoking week, and it's also a real pleasure for me to be part of this first major convening of the Columbia Climate School, the world's first climate school for advancing a comprehensive approach to climate science, delivering climate solutions, and empowering the next generation of climate leaders. Like Radley said, my name is Dan Zarilli, and I just joined Columbia as the special advisor on climate sustainability to support the creation of the new climate school and the decarbonization of the campus in line with its commitment to be a carbon neutral university. But before I joined Columbia, I served for 8 years in the mayor's office under both mayors Bloomberg and de Blasio. And of course, I was thrilled when Radley asked me to share some reflections during this session. First, let me add my thanks to everyone participating in this week. Of the many challenges that we all face from a changing climate, few seem harder for practitioners to grapple with than the issues around forced migration due to sea level rise, coastal storms, and other climate threats. Buyouts, managed retreat, strategic relocation, climate migration, whatever we end up calling it, these tend to be some of the most traumatic aspects of any pre or post-disaster adaptation planning process. I believe it was Jackie Patterson who earlier this week posed some of the best questions about this of really who's doing the managing, who's being managed, who's being paid, and who pays throughout this whole process. This issue is clearly comprehensive, requiring a combination of climate science, social sciences, psychology, engineering, planning, and touch upon every aspect of life in a coastal community, including housing, commerce, infrastructure. It brings up all the hard questions of environmental and climate justice, the role of redlining and segregation, questions of equity. This complexity is exactly what makes it exactly the type of problem that the climate school is being created to help solve. After 8 years in a public-facing role like mine, you develop some, maybe I can call them coping mechanisms for handling tough questions when you're out in public. And anything to do with managed retreat definitely fell into that kind of category, whether it was coming from those who would show the maps of sea level rise in New York City out, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, and suggest that we should be planning around exactly those types of maps in the here and now, or whether it was the more immediate questions coming from communities that wanted to protect themselves before the next storm season, and everything in between about how to best approach issues of coastal adaptation, resilience, where can we protect with levees or living shorelines, who might have to move and when, the role of land use and flood maps, how to elevate homes and not end up with a mix of elevated and unelevated homes adjacent to one another. As all of you know, none of this is easy. And that's especially true for elected officials. And why is that? I think it's a helpful question to answer. A lot has been said about how hard this is for electeds to contemplate such drastic action as relocating an entire community. That's undoubtedly true. Issues of infrastructure, loss of tax base, messages of disinvestment, all the themes that you've heard throughout this whole week, these are all real and even more so in smaller communities. But I think that at its core, these aren't really the driving factor. I think this fundamentally is about real, unimaginable loss of community and cultural heritage from a world that's changing rapidly before our eyes. And the path forward is clearly not as simple, as we all know, as just coming up with a better, more palatable name than retreat. It requires confronting this reality of loss as a community, indeed as a nation and a globe together. Do we as a society really know how to contemplate 6 or more feet of sea level rise by the end of the century in a place like the Rockaway Peninsula, home to over 115,000 residents in Queens here in New York City? And it's, of course, not just that one location, doesn't just stop at the end of the century. And the reality is that the social disruption from global change is going to overwhelm our ability to manage any of it well if we don't get our act together. Confronting the reality of this loss means helping our residents through each stage of what promises to be difficult conversations and trauma from here on out. What politician with only 1 or 2 4-year terms in office will feel the right incentives to tackle this proactively, or have the credibility and the time to complete a process like this? And how can it be done equitably in the face of things like federal cost-benefit ratios and the like? Except, of course, the reality is that as an elected official, the issue may be thrust upon you in the worst possible moment, after a hurricane or a wildfire hits your community, and you're least able to handle the complexity or delicate nature of the conversation, all while trying to navigate a disorienting federal recovery program. The desire to get back home and return to normal, if you will, become overwhelming for all the obvious reasons in those moments. Of course, we lived through all of that here in New York City after Hurricane Sandy. In reality, if I'm allowed to say so, I think the city's done a pretty amazing job grappling with the reality of climate risks in the almost 9 years since that event, putting forth plans, standards, billions of dollars in investments for adaptation and greater resilience across our city and in our coastal communities. Yes, includes a variety of built and nature-based coastal protections that tend to dominate the headlines. What got maybe less attention from the headlines was the work to implement smarter land use in our coastal communities and the amazing community-led planning processes like in Edgemere that considered issues of relocation away from the shoreline. The city secured first ever agreements with FEMA to add future risks onto our flood maps, another critical piece of the puzzle. And yes, there were some targeted acquisitions and buyouts as well. But again, right after a disaster is a really hard time to begin talking about managed retreat. And we saw some of the the successes and challenges of that in a place that I know well. I'm sure the examples on Staten Island have been discussed this week, maybe as a success, perhaps as a bit of a cautionary lesson. For those not aware, 3 different communities on the east shore of Staten Island lobbied for and received the opportunity to, as a community, to sell their homes to the state to return those communities to nature. A good effort for sure. And I happen to live not too far from some of these communities. In fact, my regular running route takes me through 2 of them. And the reality is that there's still plenty of homes there, some elevated, some not in both areas. I happened to notice just last night, the city must have recently repaved one of the streets there. It's not a criticism. There's still New Yorkers living there and the infrastructure needs to be maintained. And some who remained have built large elevated homes and seem to be enjoying the large side yards where they used to have neighbors. These are challenging questions, and it's not clear to me what comes next after this experience for some of these communities, which incidentally here will all soon be behind a large Army Corps levee that's heading towards construction. And so while some of the vulnerability is now permanently removed for sure, one study I've seen demonstrated that of those relocated in one of the communities, almost all of the households ended up in areas of higher social vulnerability. Many households relocated into other areas exposed to coastal flood risk. I don't say this as criticism. It's a real case study to learn from and to think through in those post-disaster moments when these conversations emerge very rapidly, so that we can learn from it and improve upon it for the future. And it takes me back just to the key insight that these kinds of plans need to be developed with communities in advance, coordinated with other planning process efforts, and pursued during blue skies and not just after the storm clouds depart. We as planners and practitioners have a responsibility to do this work, to kickstart these conversations, to develop these community-led plans that de-risk the outcomes for our elected leaders so that the issue becomes less scary. To see that it can also be an opportunity to reimagine our future together. And so, I mean, in reality, what I worry most about in all this is that if we don't get these questions right, if we don't get these conversations right, that the whole idea of a managed retreat at this necessary scale may be practically impossible, and the transition could be anything but managed, anything but orderly, with predictable inequities and climate injustices. And so I think it becomes so critically important for those of us in the practitioners and policymaker space to kickstart these conversations with communities, to make sure we have community-led solutions and get to real better opportunities to get ourselves through these moments and to really address these kinds of challenges. I'd also be remiss, of course, if I didn't make the point that these challenges only get harder for all of us if we don't get our global emissions under control and back in line with the Paris Agreement targets, primarily by ending the age of fossil fuels as we know it. But that is perhaps a topic for another day. I want to thank everyone for participating in this conference, and we hope to see you back here at Columbia for future climate school convenings and solutions-oriented events. This type of challenge is exactly why we are creating a new climate school, and we're thrilled that you've been able to join us. With that, thanks again for the opportunity to address and offer some reflections on this important topic. And Radley, back to you.
Thank you, Dan. Fantastic. That served just the role we were looking for, the blend of inspiration and giving us the sort of clear-eyed view of some of the challenges on the ground and some of the sort of real politic dimensions. So thank you. Okay, so with that, we are going to go into our panel with 4 colleagues joining me. Before I introduce them, or really have them introduce themselves, talking a little bit about how their work and interests align with our managed retreat conference topics, I want to give all of you here, a little sense of the goals for this session. So we're going to be posing 4 questions, not just to the 4 panelists you're about to meet, but to all of you, because we really want to hear each of your thoughts. So as I pose a question to our 4 panelists, you all will see it appear in your chat as well. Please give some responses, and then we'll upscale them, and we'll have a chance to mention at least a few of them before we go on to the next question. And I'll also maybe briefly mention a few comments that some folks who weren't able to attend this session sent to me that they'd like to hear highlighted. Okay, so with that, I will pose the first question. I will then go to our 4 panelists, asking them to introduce themselves, and either for each of the questions or for some of the questions as you see fit, give us your perspective, and then we can turn to audience after we've heard from each of you. Okay, so the first question we're going to pose, and I should also mention that there's the survey that's available. So we're looking for everyone to fill out the survey too. This is not a substitute for that survey. It's a targeted subset of questions related to what we've taken away from the conference and next steps going forward that we really want to hone in on over this hour, really, or so, a little less. Okay, question number one. What do you feel has been emphasized more at this conference than you anticipated? Maybe it's a surprise, maybe it's relative to the conference 2 years ago, but as you reflect on the last 4 days, what's maybe a keyword or a theme that really has been more prominently emphasized than you might have expected it to be going in? Okay, so I will start out just asking you, Nadia, to say a little about yourself, and would love to hear some of your reflections on this question.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Radley, for the invitation to participate on this panel. I'm really honored to be here amongst all these distinguished scholars. So my name is Nadia Seeteram, and I'm a PhD candidate at Florida International University. I first started to engage with this work, I think a bit more when I was working for the New York State Governor's Office of Storm Recovery and engaging with some of the managed retreat work then. And so it really led right directly into my PhD. And now I work more on issues of climate mobility in Miami-Dade, in Miami-Dade County, issues trying to think through the ways in which risk is dynamic, variable over space and time, and also differing amongst communities of varying vulnerabilities. So I wasn't at the conference last year, so this was all very new for me. And so I don't know if this was a surprise, but if so, it was very pleasant. I was really, really excited to see the space that was given to community members, Indigenous leaders, tribal leaders to voice their own stories. I think there is so much power in that. For me, especially as part of our education, a lot of these issues, these sites exist as case studies. So to hear directly from these leaders about their grief, their loss, their hopes, the issues, I think that was just so powerful, so enriching, and I really took a lot out of that. I also was really excited to see how many presentations featured qualitative work, survey work, interview work with decision makers, community members, just really seeing academics, practitioners really engage from the bottom up and try to develop mental models of where people are, their concerns, again, making space for that and integrating that into adaptive processes. I think for me was, again, not having participated in this conference before, just really, really great to see.
Yeah, I think even having not been to the last conference, you nevertheless really keyed in on what I feel also were some really emerging themes even the last 2 years. Okay, great. Linda, let's go to you next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on this panel, and it's congratulations to you and all the other organizers for putting forward an incredible online experience. It's been really streamlined, as I think Miyuki said earlier, and you've drawn a lot of the key people and lots of new voices, so good job for you all. I think a couple things. Oh, I guess I should say who I am. I'm an assistant professor at Cornell's Department of City and Regional Planning in Ithaca, New York. And I do work that looks at the implications of adaptation practices on equity and injustice, finding oftentimes that a lot of the emerging practices sometimes worsen our inequality on the ground, and then interrogating the kinds of land governance strategies that are necessary to try to remedy or to open the envelope of opportunities so that people can make the decisions we hope that we all kind of want to see on the ground. I was there 2 years ago. It was a fantastic in-person conference then too. I think for me, what I've been surprised by is just how many people are out there researching and thinking about these issues around the world, how many different examples that we have, and just learning how difficult this is everywhere that it is, how complicated, and the diversity of experiences from tribal communities to rural agrarian communities to major big cities to suburbs and all the rest of it. Like Nadia, I appreciated 2 years ago already the emphasis then on Indigenous perspectives and disadvantaged Black minority perspectives in the US, and that blossomed even more this time. I think we really had such strong emphasis on radical perspectives, decolonization, and situating front and center with all of the keynotes, the impacts of racial injustice in this country. At the same time, I think it was still stark, the divides between the very normatively driven panels and discussions around equity and justice, and then the very separate set of conversations around the kind of policy, technical, legal dimensions. And you could even see in the participants of who was giving talks and what language they were using. It's very different communities of practice. And even if they kind of touch on each other's issues, we don't really see what does decolonization mean for the legal landscape of property rights, or what does Black Lives Matter mean for the insurance industry. And if anything, I think maybe this time we had more participants on the more radical progressive side. And I tried to attend many sessions, but I'm not certainly, cognizant of the entire agenda. But for me, it felt like there were fewer people who were here from the kind of financial industries and the technical agencies, the kind of professional spheres that actually control all the things, the systems, the codes, the standards that produce the unequal environments that we have. And so I think that it continues to be a real struggle to bridge those different communities.
Thank you. Okay, let's now go to Miyuki.
Great. Thanks, Radley. And I really want to echo the appreciation of Columbia and all of the organizing work that has gone into this. It's been a wonderful event and really, really smooth. I am an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I work on climate impacts and adaptation, and especially lots of my research focuses on public policy around the questions that we've been grappling with this week. How are people affected by, and how do they respond to both gradual and acute environmental change? I was at this event 2 years ago, and I think I absolutely echo both what Nadia and Linda said, which is, this is, I think, to me, an unusual and wonderful forum for centering voices that we don't often hear from. And that's just, I think it's not a particularly common feature, especially for conferences that are academically oriented, but it's wonderful. I think two other changes that I noticed from a couple of years ago. First, I thought there was much more representation of the Global South. Still not enough, I think, but I think compared to a couple of years ago, we did hear more about the drivers of human mobility, especially political, economic, and how kind of differently and similarly people in developing and low-income countries are confronting these challenges. The other change I noticed is, I think, more of a focus on receiving communities than we had a couple of years ago, which I also think is a really key part of this puzzle. And I feel like I heard it both from local government officials who were talking about actively incorporating the receiving communities into some of their planning, as well as more from the research side. And I think increasingly that linkage is going to become more and more central to the way that we are working to tackle this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, Susie.
Yes, thank you. So Susie Moser, she, her pronouns. I'm an independent researcher based in Western Massachusetts on the land of the Norwottuck. And gosh, what can I say? Well, let me maybe draw the arc of my work first and then let that inform sort of my comments here on what I think we've emphasized more this time. So I've worked on coastal adaptation for 25 years. Back then there was a handful and now there's 800 people in this room and there's so many that didn't come, right? So there's the community is just exploded. And over that time, you know, way back when it was social vulnerability assessments and impact assessment, risk assessments, and now we're dealing much and no conversation really about retreat other than in sort of theory. And here we are having that conversation. I'm quite interested and have been over this entire time over the question of how do we know we're moving in the right direction with adaptation? What is success? And that question has come up here too. What will be successful retreat and the complexity of that? I think it's a special case of, you know, the broader question of how adaptation succeeds, but it's a really, really interesting one for me. And the other question that has been occupying me for maybe the last 5 years or so is, how do we deal with this emotionally? As the people working on the front lines of this work on a daily basis, and given how conflictual this is very likely to be, what are the capacities we need to deal with constant traumatic and transformative change? I think that sort of sums up what we're looking at. And I think we're not even close to beginning to understand all that, but I think at least that's something that interests me a lot. And so I was quite interested in the many more sessions we had this times that looked at that, at the emotional side and the capacity building sides of doing this kind of work. And related to that, I think really wonderful that we had a much better mix this time of bringing science and practice together into this conference. So we must be doing something right in terms of, you know, actually speaking the language and speaking to the concerns of practitioners and really learning from each other in these sessions. I'm echoing mostly, you know, in terms of uplifting BIPOC perspectives and really centering, giving, well, simply finally us white people making space for that to, you know, and I maybe just want to simply point to this panel. Look of who is here. And in particular, I'm so deeply pleased that I have 3 young colleagues of mine on this panel, and, you know, 3 women too. I want to emphasize how many women are at this conference. I don't know the statistics, but it's just really telling. The adaptation field is a predominantly female field, and I'm so delighted that we actually, you know, give that the proper place where it needs to be.
Yeah, that's going to be an action item to us to send that and other facts around. Some of them. That's great. Thank you all so much for those comments. I'll very quickly summarize a few things from the chat and that we heard from steering committee, and then we can move on to the next question. So in the chat, a comment about appreciative of all the focus on terminology, that words matter. Talk, as we just heard from Susie and others, about the importance of the emotional piece and the willingness, the need to engage with on-the-ground communities, including those who've been affected and suffered disasters, and the call for, or the presence of a great deal of social science. Those are things those of you in the conference just posted. Additionally, some steering group members called out, people who attended 2 years ago, that we've seen since then a development of more creative ways of trying to tackle these issues, whether it's understanding the motivations of people involved in retreat, again, providing emotional or psychological support. We heard from another steering group member about how the tent appears to be broadening for managed retreat. Inclusion now of more disaster force displacement issues and resettlement issues internationally as compared to 2 years ago. And also the need for and uses of development aid for broader topics of climate migration, how funding is needed for both in situ adaptation and facilitated migration. That, I think, is something we had more of this time than 2 years ago. And relatedly, we heard that, you know, a lot more government and nonprofit representation this time. The sense is that government agencies, at minimum, are learning and listening about these challenges of managed retreat to a greater extent, maybe, than was the case 2 years ago. Okay, I'm realizing I'm going to have to move us a little more quickly through these questions. So turning now to the second question, which we'll again post for all of you in the chat. Maybe let's try to take, this might be one we can take a little more quickly. Give us an example, if you have one, of something that you learned at this conference that you didn't really know before. Could be a small point, could be a major theme, but what's a real kind of novel takeaway or new thing that you learned this time around? Okay, and I'll just let any of the four of you jump in with an idea.
I'll just quickly mention one thing. I asked in one session about whether or not the issues in developing countries are comparable to those in developed countries here, in particular in the US, but also Europe and other, Australia, which was represented, and learned about some really specific differences in the discourse. And also in the policy context that raises such different expectations of government, what the role is, to what extent we are entitled to protection by the government, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a really interesting aspect to me, that, while some of the economics might be the same, the processes might be the same, but the communication about it and how we think about retreat, I think is quite different.
Thank you, Susie. Others?
I think this was something that I took away from a number of the sessions is just how blurry a lot of these categories that we think about are, from voluntary to forced, from pre to post disaster. I think how much of a move is driven by climate or an event versus other forces that are pushing people, and maybe the disaster is a trigger or accelerates things, but isn't really necessarily the core thing. I think it's easy to think of these things in these nice little discrete bins, but they definitely are not that way in practice.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I think sorry.
Please, no, good, yeah.
I think for me, just sort of a theme that I saw running through a lot of presentations are people actually safer after we move? And that really speaks to the challenge of risks that are manifesting as time progresses, cascading impacts that we are sort of now realizing are materializing. That whether that means siting refugee camps in different places, whether that means trying to predict the ways in which geographies will be affected, especially those receiving communities. I think that's something that I think about, but probably will put a bit more emphasis on as well.
Yeah, that resonates a lot for me as well, that last point.
Just to echo Susie, I thought it was really great to see so many more international presentations. A lot of them from Europe, and I agree with Miyuki that we could do with many more from the global south. I mean, we saw so many presentations about Mutak and Ile de Jean Charles, but I think none about Mumbai or Bangkok or so many of the huge cities that are at risk all over the world, especially in the global south. And so I guess partly I love Jola Ajibade's keynote, where she was able to synthesize so many cases around the world and begin to put them in conversation with one another. And to echo Sider's keynote, where she said this kind of work is still needs a lot more of that kind of work. I think that's definitely true. A question that came to my mind was, what is the role of this conference, and whether in the future it feels presently like a conference dedicated, as I think Dan noted, this is a conference that's geared towards, helping New York, or Columbia is like situated in New York, and Sandy. A lot of this is around, well, what should the United States be doing? And so is the presence of international cases here basically a kind of mirror to the world where we can learn from abroad to apply it to the US? Or is this a global conversation where there's a need for South-South or South-North kinds of discussions and learning across these different boundaries? And I think that really means, to your final question later on, like, what is the future of this conference? Where should it expand? And depending on those directions, it could go in really quite different places.
Absolutely.
I guess I'll just throw in one last thing. The thing that I especially learned from all of the comparative work that was there was the importance of land. And we could say a lot more about land, but everywhere it seemed that communities that were really traumatized and negatively impacted was where they didn't have control of the land, including for tribes that did not have federal recognition of their tribal status or otherwise did not have rights to the land. And I think there was one presentation about, for instance, Indonesia, Philippines, and Japan, where Kaneko showed that the Indonesian experience was the most positive for the community. They were most empowered to act because they had collective land ownership from the beginning, and that collective right to the land enabled them to make decisions and to act moving forward. So I think that for me, the importance of land and the centrality of that is going to be a big one moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to do a quick sort of comic interlude here. In a prior life, used to watch a lot of sports on television, and a peeve of mine used to be when you could visually see someone posing a question, in that case to the athlete, and you could tell they weren't listening to the answer, just something about their expression. They were already thinking about the next question when the answer. I find myself doing that right now as I'm trying to, it's because I'm trying to assimilate the questions that are coming in from the audience. So I wish I'm not able to give as much response to these great comments that we're hearing from each of you, but know they're registered, and I know the audience is hearing all these great things you're hearing. But so towards trying to assimilate a few things that came in while you were speaking, again, on this notion of what you learned. Someone said that it's new for them to think about climate-driven relocations in the context of other relocations that have happened, such as for the building of interstate highways or buyouts in communities with toxic air and water, such as Love Canal. Someone else learned that generally there's a lot of action looking at the movers across a number of aspects, but there seems to be less attention planning-wise, research-wise, looking into where these movers may go, a theme that Miyuki emphasized. Is starting to emerge in this, at least in this conference, by when and what changes are needed in those receiving areas. Another person was struck by all the calls for institutional innovation. Okay, so with that, let's go, I think, to a really, really important question that we should spend quite a bit of time on. Question 3, and that is, what was missing from this conference? What ideas, what voices, you name it, format, what was missing? Anybody?
I think it was in the background in a lot of the conversations we've had this week, but a very clear lens on housing issues and the provision of safe and affordable housing and how large of a role that plays in a lot of the conversations we're having. I think there was perhaps less input from the people who are tasked with that every single day and who are kind of trying to confront this challenge of, can we create places that are safe, that are attractive, that are, have access to educational and economic opportunity and that people can afford to live in? I think that perhaps is one area where we could try to bring in more of a focus in future years. I think it was definitely in the background in most of the talks, but maybe wasn't squarely the focus in many of them, at least not the ones that I was in.
Yeah, I agree. Others?
I'd like to echo Dr. Moser's thoughts on capacities needed for this type of work, and also some of the institutional barriers that have come up as we sort of talk through this. When we are trying to center equity, people, and justice, that work is very difficult. It's very sensitive. It's very emotional. I've heard a colleague refer to it as heart work. And as researchers, we need to be present, emotionally available to hold space for community members, leaders who are talking about this work, the difficulties and the challenges that they're facing in their own lives. And I found myself a little bit ill-equipped for that. And so I think moving forward, that could be something that we try to develop as a, in our capacity as researchers, how to be present, how to emotionally hold space, how to validate, how to really conduct this hard work. And I also think on the institutional side, really thinking about how we can, I heard Dr. Bronin mention that she would like to see community organizations be invited to grant writing opportunities and be integral in that process. But I think we also need to think really critically about the barriers to that actually happening, where, content-wise, I think, we can do a better a job of that. But I also think on the process side, community organizations are doing direct services to their community. They are, advocating in legislative sessions. They've got a lot going on. And so I think the paperwork part could be, if that burden could somehow be reduced on the institutional side, I think that would be really helpful. And I think also compensation in really meaningful ways for the community, not this sort of gift card model, could be really helpful for, again, just sort of advancing and bringing people to the table.
Thank you.
I
Linda?
guess, I don't, Susie, I'll go first and then you can end our round here. I thought it was interesting what was not talked about as we talked about managed retreat, of which other things are not being asked to retreat. So we talked so much about Southern Louisiana and the crisis for communities there. Nobody really talked about, oil and gas industry or retreat of, we talked about tribal rights and communities. We don't talk about getting out of oil and gas on tribal land, whether that's in Dakota or Alaska or in Louisiana. And we talked a lot about drought and fire risk, but we didn't talk about water policy and the fact that we have all these diversion projects. Some of them might intensify because of the drought and water needs in Southern California or in Arizona. So I think that there's, and then there's like a number of things where as we begin to talk about maintenance and like at what point managed retreat, there's all these systemic institutions where a state could choose to push managed retreat in a kind of cynical and negative way by withdrawing resources like schools and other things. And I think some of the tribal communities talked about how there were school closures ahead of when they had to do buyouts. So there are all these kind of systemic institutions, like material institutions, without even getting into the legal institutions, that are really important. And we didn't really talk about what kinds of those policies we want to retreat and force to change in order to open up the possibility of people engaging in managed retreat. I think there's a lot of really difficult questions around land sharing, because inevitably when you retreat, you're going somewhere else. And there's a lot of possibility there, because wherever people go, they will be generating new consumption and development and tax revenue. But the people there, somehow we have to be talking about land sharing. We didn't talk about reparations, for instance, and what rights of land redistribution could be part of all of these different things. So to the practitioners who are listening, who are like, do you know how difficult it is to even talk about a buyout? Like talking about reparations and linking this thing to other things might be even more difficult, but I think that it's also quite necessary from a policy perspective. I also think that so some of those sectors, again, were not present. And that's a question of like, is that a dimension that we want to expand on in the future for this conference? And then I guess the last thing that was really interesting was how many people talked about the tax loss issue as being a major barrier for any community moving away or talking to officials or getting their buy-in. But there were a few conversations about, well, what do we do with that? Is that just the reality we accept? We're willing to accept so many other things, like people moving across the oceans, or people living in elevated houses or floating houses, or like all these crazy physical moves. But there's an assumption that our policy instruments are going to be static. And maybe that's realistic, because when you look at Supreme Court and other appeal courts, different kinds of decisions, we're becoming more and more conservative and more rigid in our interpretation of these land rights. But I think that there's a need for us to also engage like fiscal policy or other things that actually shape, again, the local decision making in order to open up those decision envelopes.
Yeah, just quickly, when you think about it or mention what we consider possible and where we have imagination, just relatedly, the issue of sort of assumptions about growth, right? Assumptions of continued growth are part of this discussion too. Susie?
You're setting it up nicely for me because my concerns mostly with the topics had to do with the assumptions. It struck me how many blind spots we have, and maybe that's how I want to frame this answer. The blind spots around speed and scope of this problem. There is an assumption that seems to be almost across the sessions that there is ample and growing federal assistance forthcoming. And I was like, really? I have yet to see that. The assumption of having time. I mean, you know, everyone talked about how long it takes to do these things. And yeah, and then we have this curve, you know. I used to say we live on the luxury end of an exponential curve. I think we have exhausted the luxury end. We're now going up the steep end of it. That means everything's going to happen faster and we have to have answers faster, but the machines of the machinery of governance doesn't work any faster. And, you know, everyone who, I just want to say it, if you can get a buyout now, get it now, because there won't be one later. There won't, you know, the problem only grows exponentially and everyone will clamor for the few dollars there are. So if you want any money at all, go take it now because it won't be there later. So to me, what is just really deeply missing from this is the scenario of what if we don't get money? What if this isn't managed retreat? If it's unmanaged retreat? What are the creative solutions we have? How do we deal with an unbelievable flood of a refugee crisis within our own borders, much less, you know, the ones coming from elsewhere where things are even worse? So I don't know, I just feel, to me, there is, you know, there is this thrill in some ways of getting better at it and having more examples and hearing more stories of what's happening. And you know, it almost, and we have this growing community that comes to this conference and it feels like, great, wonderful, we're on it. Yeah, and you know, I looked at the number of times implementation was really talked about. It's really tiny still.
Yeah.
The reality of making this happen is minuscule compared to the growing problem. And there are cities around the country now where in 5-10 years, the septic systems will fail. You will not have easy access to your homes anymore. And that's the end of that, right? So I think we need to really get way more creative and way more realistic about how bad the situation is.
Yeah, something about, I think you have a gift, Susie, because you know, you just really honestly, you know, revealed the extent of the challenge, how close some of these societal tipping points may be, but somehow there's an optimism that comes through when you say it, that I struggle with when sort of pointing out some of those dire dimensions. So there is a way to stay positive, but a way to leverage urgency in a way that's positive and just, which it isn't always when urgency is brought up. Okay, I think we got a lot of really good comments from the attendees and some very trenchant comments from a steering group member that I want to quickly mention as well on this issue of what was missing. Okay, I'm just going to run through these. I heard a lot about community engagement, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I sensed confusion about how to actually do community engagement. There were a few presenters who touched on actual methods, but clearly there may need to be a more intentional dialogue between those who engage with communities and those who don't. Another person said there didn't seem to be much reference to food security, how retreat and relocation would impact people's access to agriculture, fisheries. What kind of impact will coastal retreat have on small scale fisheries? How will retreat from wildfire zones impact agriculture? Someone else talked about actionable tools. Many sessions talked about the challenges, need for engagement. Fewer tools were mentioned that addressed how to move forward, including engaging with council, policy, law, and economic powerhouses that hold all the cards at the table. Another person felt they didn't see a lot of talk about infrastructure, utilities, and essential services alongside housing managed retreat. Someone noted that panelists mentioned a need for more case studies and speakers from the Global South. A related need for perspective is on the discussions that play out at the international scale. For example, UNFCCC. We talked a lot about multi-level governance, but not so much how that ties into international negotiations on climate adaptation. And how can models of self-determination that are piloted at the local scale be best voiced at the international stage? Okay, and then some salient points from a steering group member. There was plenty of problem identification, but still almost no solution identification other than we need more fair processes. Few took the risk of telling what these fair processes might look like. We need more vision. More putting ideas out there that may prove to be wrong, may prove to be right, but put them out there. The same person mentioned a double-edged sword of optimism that we as scholars can inform some public oversight to remediate and plan, but acknowledged a less appreciated and talked about risk that the public sector might actually be losing ground to the private sector, whose activities in the space have largely gone unexamined, noting that having a conversation about insurance is, as they put it, not in the same vicinity of what that challenge is. Interesting points there. This next comment, I think I'll just frame generally as an online conference isn't a very easy platform for disagreement, pushing back on ideas, and that sort of healthy volley and respectful exchange. Clearly we had some of it, but it's a lot tougher to do that in a Zoom meeting, and this person really felt that. And then a final point, just sort of similar to Susie's, good engagement, but still small scale and space and time. We're thinking too small, too short term. The concepts of these broad scale movements of people and communities, for example. All right, more things came in while I was talking. I think we got to jump to the fourth question here, though, which is also going to, rightly demand some time, and that is, what next steps do you anticipate personally taking in your research or your practice? I think you could extend that a little more to, your personal experience if you'd like to, but definitely interested in hearing about how your research or practice might shift. This could be a cross-pollination of with a new concept, a new researcher, a new stakeholder you heard about this conference. Maybe it's a eureka inspiration, intellectual or emotional that hit you during the conference. That's going to lead you in a new direction, or maybe cause you to sort of speed up something you've been thinking about in the back burner. Any comments on that question? Just to reiterate again. Next steps you anticipate personally taking in your research or your practice, ideally sort of as a result of something that happened in the conference. Anybody?
So right before the conference started, I shared with a couple colleagues a draft concept note for future research, which I was calling, what was it? Governing Land for a Dynamic Earth. And I thought, I finally found a name for my lab and an acronym. It could be GLADE, but it's too S.C. Johnson, I think. So I can't keep that scented, perfumed lab name. But I'm super interested in this, as I noted, this issue of land rights and the different kinds of property rights regimes. And so as you think about land, it gets into all the issues from the very superficial ones around should we do land readjustment or transfers of development rights or zoning? Those kinds of things, even within a capitalist system, there are so many opportunities to learn from the cases of retreat or relocation or resettlement around the world, whether it is for floods or climate change or earthquakes or other things. And many countries have done, I think, a much better approach of actually finding ways to engage in collective action and collective benefit sharing to some extent that we might be able to learn from. But I think the broader question of land rights and land policy are the more normative and fundamental issues of land ethics and how we understand our human natural relationships to land. And so I think that there is an opportunity where we can begin to put in conversation indigenous perspectives on land, or Black freedom farms and modern perspectives on land, or cooperative and community places, many places that live very differently from the current urban and dense settlements that we have. And so are the land rights and the technologies of adaptation necessarily interlinked, or are they interchangeable? Could we actually mix those? Or does it mean that if you want to have indigenous based land ethics, you can only really live in a more rural or not urban settlement? Or can we actually bring those concepts into an urban sphere? And in what way would that happen? So I think there's a lot that's around comparative issues and land rights, and that was inspired from this conference as well. And if anybody is interested in participating or engaging in that research, please write me, and I would love to talk with you.
I suspect you'll be getting some emails. Interesting point. Others?
There's one thing Susie just said, which really helped crystallize a lot of what I've been thinking about in the last couple of days. She said we have to be way more creative and way more realistic, and that often feels like it's in such tension with each other. And I think in the plenary, I don't know if this was yesterday or the day before, I really felt that same tension where, you know, we've heard so much about these fundamental injustices and oppressive structures, and the fact that there are worldviews and values that are not being acknowledged, and these seem like huge problems. And then at the same time, we've heard about these really concrete, seemingly fixable problems, right? Things like we need to compensate people more. We need to enable people to buy a better house, right? To actually have enough money to replace their housing if we're going to buy them out. And I think that's definitely this feeling of like some of these problems are too small and then some of them are too big is really a struggle, both personally in my work, and I think just more broadly in the field. It's very hard to keep all of that in tension and at the front of mind. But I feel like that idea of being more creative and more realistic and being comfortable pursuing both of those things at the same time is a really helpful framing for me for thinking about this work moving forward.
Yeah. I feel like it has some points of overlap with some of the ideas around top-down versus local, more just innovative, sort of bottom-up adaptation type approaches, and just the challenge of scale, which does also get to that issue of urgency. Some of the, yeah, absolutely. Others?
I was really struck by Dr. Ajibade's keynote talk, I think yesterday, and her framing of justice and the intersections of justice. And for me personally, the intergenerational justice concept is something that I think I'll be taking forward in my work, because interestingly enough, I spend quite a lot of time, or I used to pre-pandemic, with some of the youth activists in Miami who were so instrumental in getting local government to declare climate emergencies, or constantly putting pressure, at least they were pre-pandemic, to get their government to act. And in my own work, I've made decisions to prioritize people at the house, making household level decisions, and not so much drawing out the ways in which the youth are their own sort of vulnerable group, in that they are inheriting this more risky, less stable world, and how exactly they are thinking about some of these issues. So that's something that has really stuck with me.
Okay, so I'll just add a couple of things. I guess I'm at a stage in my career where I've remade myself a number of times, and I have to tell you right now, I'm not so much interested in breaking out a whole new research topic, as I'm far more interested in a couple of things. One is to keep the back of you all, you who are in the early career stages and who are doing such courageous work at the science policy interface. I'm far more interested in making sure that you get the whatever support you need to get your tenure and advance in your careers, than for me to come up with yet another great idea. So that's one. The second one has to do with networking. I feel like there are scholarly and practitioner communities that are dealing with related issues that are very relevant but haven't been talked about here. So for example, there is a growing community that is all about transformations to sustainability. And hardly 2 or 3 people from the conference audience that I know of are in that, have a foot in that community and are mostly here. And I would love for those communities to be far more interrelated. So bridge building, making connections, networking is higher on my list. And the third sort of key issue that I would want to emphasize is to basically be a trusted advisor to the people who would be willing to be courageous and take leadership in doing very uncomfortable things, because that's what transformation is all about.
Fantastic. Any other comments? Okay.
Radley, can I say one more thing about, which is really beyond the research thing, but there has been a piece, an audience missing for me at this conference, and that is federal policy leaders. So congressional and White House leadership has been sorely missing. We know that, we don't have yet a central person for climate resilience in the White House. If so, it's going to be far more sidelined than, folks focusing on mitigation. But I would love to see our lead folks on coastal resilience from Congress, from the Senate, from the White House, whoever is going to be there in 2 years, and make sure that they don't just come to, give their speeches and leave, but be at the conference and be deeply involved. I feel like the learning wheels have come off at this conference. We have a lot to offer now, a lot to say, and we now need the people at the top to actually, put the pieces together in terms of finance and some governance reforms of policy. We have no coastal retreat policy in this country. And I just feel like it's absolutely critical that we get those things rolling, given how long it all takes to make it happen and get it coordinated. So I really urge us to think, if we do this again, to have that presence far more centrally here.
Yeah, totally agree.
Wait, was that your question number 4, or was that just a 3B?
Overall, we're into question 4 now, although
Okay.
your comment may not have, but we're definitely well into question 4. I guess you do that, Linda. Okay.
I guess I would say I interpreted your question as like, oh, what are you doing next? But I think there's a different question of what are we collectively should we be doing next?
Right.
I don't know that we have.
That's a perfect seg to a question I was just going to pose that came in from Bill Selecki, that I think gets a little more to beyond our own sort of personal roles as we see them. Bill said, what does the panel see as the key knowledge, data, and information gaps that were revealed by the conference? What's the realm of research? And yeah, I would encourage folks to take that a little further to, what research and engagement and policy do those gaps suggest are needed?
So I think this is where Susie ended on. We don't have a managed retreat plan, but we don't have a national adaptation plan, period. Mm-hmm. And my colleague Sierra Woodruff, who I think many of you may know, has left Texas A&M to be at the State Department, said, oh, I've been working with the UNFCCC on the last few weeks, helping these other countries, telling them how to write their national adaptation plans and revise them in order to get USAID funding, but we don't have one for our country, right? So I think that that's a huge gap that we should be helping advance nationally. And right now we have potentially a 1.3/4.0 trillion dollars headed towards infrastructure, including $47 billion slated for coastal infrastructure. What does this community of scholars and practitioners think about that? Do we agree on how that money should be spent? Do we want that to be spent on coastal infrastructure to shore up places or not? And under what conditions would you shore up infrastructure instead of saying we should be moving people? And so I think that if the organizers of the conference are able to synthesize what we learned and to be able to push that towards a policy, memo or something that communicates with the White House and others there, we should be informing those kinds of policy directions right now. That's quite urgent.
I think when we're thinking about risk disclosure, corporate risk disclosure, somewhat related point of, getting beyond the, good focus that we're seeing now on identification of hazards, things like, are you going to be in a flood zone? Are your employees going to be directly affected by heat waves? It's great that we're seeing those things, and it's, starting this conversation, but our conference has, pointed to all these interconnections, all these cascading impacts. And how do we get to a point where we're pushing corporations and other entities, including the government, a lot harder in terms of being imaginative in really thinking about all the ways that they can be affected beyond just sort of the immediate climate exposures to their assets. So that COVID's shown us a lot through some of these supposedly, unpredictable cascading impacts that in some ways are very predictable, right? The vulnerable population suffering the most, and so on. So I'd say we got about 5 more minutes. I think, sticking with this question, if you want to either take it as sort of Bill Selecki's dimension of the missing data and information gaps, and what realm of research they point to, or do you want to go arguably a little broader, as Linda just did and say what's needed, not just in your own work, but more broadly?
Both?
Yeah, all of the above. We got 5 minutes. Say it all. We got 5 minutes.
Okay. So I think, building on what Linda just said about something to go to the White House, I think there are thousands and thousands of consultants who have not been here and who should know what was said here. I think we should really think hard about how do we get the wonderful recordings and maybe syntheses of those things out to people who will write all the hazard mitigation plans and comp plans for local communities, and who just simply need to hear how to engage much more effectively, how to frame this whole thing as a people issue rather than a property issue, and so on and so forth. There were some really amazing things said at this conference. And I think, that needs to also go into the receiving communities. I mean, the wake up call that they have coming is just really huge. We have most of the people living in coastal communities, in coastal counties, and they're going to go somewhere else. So I think that needs to just simply come out. There's one other idea. I'll come back to it if it comes back. I lost the thought, but anyway.
Yeah, I think I want to let's go to Miyuki and Nadia. If you want to comment on this sort of general question we've been talking about, or more generally sort of steering towards any last words or comments you'd like to make as we wrap.
I think there's a lot that was presented here that shows that we're working on a lot of the challenges and we don't have answers yet necessarily. Right, we have, I think, a growing awareness of. Someone said in the comments actually that people understand how fundamental local leadership is and community engagement is, but we don't have a blueprint of any sort, right, to do it. I think tying together, I think one thing that Linda said about, there's money that's going to go into infrastructure right now. Right, combined with this urgency and the fact that we don't know where that next storm is going to hit, and we don't have the luxury of doing a perfect planning process in every place before that next event hits. So I think one question then is what do we do now, right? Or what is the next choice? Like, what is the thing that we can recommend or consider or put on the table now? Given that we might not have the luxury of time to do what might be ideal in a lot of places, right? What's the second best? What's the near-term action that can be taken that ultimately fosters the long-term stuff that we all know is so important, but we might not actually be able to go through in the way that we would ideally in every place, given the scope and the speed of the changes we're seeing. So I think the fact that we don't really right now have this short-term vision is is maybe one thing that's holding us back from having these conversations with policymakers and politicians, and tackling that then puts us in a better position for bringing these people into our conversations.
Yeah, and to address Bill Seleckley's question, I think that what I've noticed, at least working in Miami, is that flooding and heat are large topics of concern, but they are operating in silos. So I'd like to see more integration in the way that we sort of tackle and think about these hazards. They're not operating in different spaces. They're operating in the exact same space. And these teams need to sort of work together to really think about these hazards as compound hazards, all the different flood risks together, the heat, the way racial and economic justice sort of intersect. I think that's a really big knowledge gap because we are at the moment kind of operating in different teams instead of sort of tackling and working together on them. And of course, health dimensions, all sorts of other things in that as well.
Yes, great. Okay, just a couple of comments came in. Susie noted in response to Bill that we need much more research and action on changing power relationships, vested interests, mindsets, and worldviews, all as preconditions for changing policy, resource flows, and practices, the deepest human dimensions. David Glassberg, as a researcher on the humanities side, is reaching out, wanting to join interdisciplinary teams looking at these issues. There's also a comment, how can we get more private industry actors involved in the conversation and actions? Folks such as developers, industry leaders, financial institutions, utility companies. Yeah, okay, David Glassberg.
I have a question I guess I would ask you and maybe others in the audience, something that I struggle with a little bit.
I do have to say, Linda, that we're
oh, you're at time. Oh, I thought we went to 2:15. Sorry.
Well, we do, but I have a few exciting announcements. How about, is it the kind of thing that could be put out there as a sort of thought?
I'll put it in the chat.
Think on? Okay, well, put it out there, but we're not gonna be able to answer it maybe.
Okay, you can answer it in the chat.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, what are that we're all here huddling, and I don't know where you're usually in your other spaces, but there's a tendency for us to all huddle. So to this last point from Nadia about being in other places, should we be out there in uncomfortable spaces, going to real estate conferences, going to transportation conferences, going to housing conferences, going to places where you're the only voice talking about this issue and trying to convert or educate or connect with others? Because I feel sometimes that we are all trying to get all those other people to come to us and support our effort, but where's the solidarity of us going to Indigenous or housing or other kinds of places where they're saying, where have you been all these years that I wanted your assistance? You were off talking about some environmental issue.
Yeah.
So I struggle with that a little bit because the incentive structures for me personally are not to do that. But I think as we talk about solidarity and interdisciplinarity, part of that responsibility might be for us to go out there.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. It's literally going out there, and there are the incentive structures, but I like the way you also noted that there's a piece too of making the effort to speak someone's language, addressing the dimensions that relate, not in a way that gives up the core principles, but that meets in a decision space that those people are used to operating in. Okay, so with that, I want to say thanks. I thought this was a really awesome panel, accomplished everything we hoped it would and more. Thank you. And with that, really closing remarks now. Save something very important for last. I am happy to report that we provisionally have decided to convene again in 2 years. The hope is that we'll be able to be in person at that time. I think, we may well consider some hybrid dimensions for a lot of reasons, whether it's carbon emissions or accessibility for all and ease of access. But our plan is to reconvene in 2 years, and we look forward to discussing with you all the ways we can incorporate some of this feedback to do it better, even better next time. And then maybe most important of all, let's see if I can quickly share screen. Yeah, time for thanks. just so appreciative of all that the Earth Institute did, Alex Halliday, the Climate School, to make this conference possible. And then the special thanks, this is all on behalf of Alex and I, Alex DeShervin and I, the special thanks to Haley Martinez, Phoebe, Adrian, all that the team and all that they did, the communication side, all the students who you saw supporting us at the conference, just helping this to go seamlessly. With special thanks to Jack Wiseman and Sydney Williams for all their efforts leading up. Anna Lopresti, as mentioned earlier, wishing her all the best in future endeavors. It's been great working with her for the last 2 years and more. And then the organizing committee, who you see here, that really behind the scenes providing the intellectual and more foundations that made this conference, to my mind, such a success. Also, special thanks to all of you presenters and attendees who made this conference, what it was. So as we wrap, I just want to thank, on behalf of all of Columbia, thank everyone. Wish you all the best during these times as the most vulnerable especially continue to endure the climate crisis, the ongoing COVID crisis, and the other simultaneous crises and challenges. Let's keep in mind that many of the challenges and opportunities that we've discussed in the context of climate and retreat also apply to all the interrelated issues that we face. So with that, thanks to everyone. We'll be in touch, and we hope to see you in 2 years and sooner. Thanks, everybody. Bye.